Alright, I'm back with this experimental theme, the myth of family. This time, part 3, the Dearth War on Poverty to Terror. Alright, touching on this again, Suzanne Schultz's Malthusian Matrix theory, which in another video, a book review I did of a book called Reproductive Racism. So if you're interested, you can go into that, which is a mix of social hierarchical and patriarchal policies guiding surface level policy by Democrats and the neocons, thus turning into the far right in the palm of neoliberal banks, usually reacting to immigration, other outside forces like terrorism, balancing freedom and national security within. Lawless violence, said Bush. Gun pointed at any Snowden. Most of the explanations are reiterated dynamics felt by most industrial nations coping with the concept of population and pension reform aging in their own way. I say they, as markets seize power and pressure our values into them, and so states, nations, have a layer of agency from how money dictates it. Corporations are people. Patterns happening after 9/11 robbed us of our privacy and kick-started enemies and genocide across the world. A gender war that's been heavily bloodthirsty before the internet, and politicians allowing pregnant children while they worship eggs as valuable human life until birth, starved of love in adoption centers for a high price. Of course, people choose their own on top of the financial gatekeep from a family, merely allowed to exist. The original 1798 Malthusian ideas go as such. Human population grows geometrically while food growth can't compete. Claims population harms wages, while the wealthy hoard stages of opportunity. The underclass are blamed, the poor on the streets as their props. Reverend Thomas Malthus advocated for courting the poor into plagued corridors of the cities. Meanwhile, hypothesized that plague and famines were normal population control checks. He didn't believe in birth control as a clergyman, giving the message of abstinence and heterosexual specific as important as agricultural for civilization to survive. For the most part, the population problem to Malthus was the poor, homeless, sexual orientation, mental illness, etc., paving a way to the culture war playbook to be used as wedge issue policies in the 21st century. Of course, as Schultz points out, to distinguish these crimes against humanity, quote, that Malthusians fight the poor, as in third world, certain parts of Africa, etc., instead of poverty, a class distinction within developed countries. A clear bias of priorities in rich countries to solve its own problems. The only difference between eugenics and population control is magnitude of severity on people and scope in terms of range. Human terraforming, in a sense. For thousands of years, humans were messing with the tools to soon affect their own kind consciously. In the time scale of 18 to 1900, the knowledge of agriculture and animal husbandry breeding was mapped and used as a blueprint for humans. In 1880, cousin of Charles Darwin, Francis Galton, among other principles, coined the term eugenics to mean good birth in Greek. This human engineering lasted into the 70s and still to this day, with Border Patrol removing reproductive organs and subaltern societies created on birth reduction movements in inner cities. Uh, though freedom to be childless was a revolutionary attack on the forced Comstock laws, and for a while the Supreme Court allowed this freedom before Roe v. Wade was struck down in 2022. One reason being eugenics and reproductive rights overlap ever since birth control advocate Margaret Sanger visited the Reverend Thomas Malthus' old home, despite his global fears of population, and preached at a KKK rally. Every nation practiced eugenics to some extent, the most famous being the one-child policy in China, which stopped in 2015. Eugenics in scope is only attempted in its own nation to the myths of purity, the originalism of its core people. Meanwhile, population control is a scale fear seen from the outside as the pro-natal nation for its own uses the gun of anti-natal to the globe, with U.S. counterterrorism and aid blurring the line with medical and global malpractice. Population control is demographic engineering, and I should have mentioned it doesn't require dead bodies, just control overall. And right now we're sort of in the algorithmic population control, so it's a little more interesting than just dead bodies. So Suzanne Solch sees demographics as the science of the status quo, demographers having to be told and reminded it's not destiny. Returning to the book for the fourth time, The Birth Dearth, What Happens When People in Free Countries Don't Have Enough Babies, a major foundation a major foundation of the book is industrial nations aging rapidly, low birth rate, and the disturbing fundamentalist call to action against Social Security, abortion, homosexuality, divorce, other alternative lifestyles, etc. I believe 2025, Project 2025 is sort of this call to action to remove all these safety nets, I believe. He, or the data, claims other demographics diluting the original nation's people out of economic security without blaming them, using facts as a euphemism for bigotry, paraphrasing, not the fault of minority demographics. Unfortunately, the national, uh, oh, sorry, not the fault of demographics from Black, Latino, Asian, etc., but the fault of the original population to not keep up with the minority demographics. Unfortunately, the national numbers game is not modern paranoia, but self-aware through national engineering and cultish pro-natalist strongmen, as quoted by Polybus in 204 122 BC. Quote, Nowadays, all over Greece, such a diminution in natality, and in general manners such depopulation, that the towns are deserted and the fields lie fallow. Although this country has not been ravaged by wars or epidemics, the cause of the harm is evident. By avarice or cowardice, the people, if they marry, will not bring up the children they ought to have. At most they bring up one or two. It is in this way that the scourge before it is uh, noticed is rapidly developed. Back to the birth dearth, specifically the chapter Practical Plans, and I've gone over this many times. It points out elderly Social Security needs to be changed as the demographic numbers drop, admitting the pension reform, and ultimately Social Security is a Ponzi game based on the cycle for the flowing bodies in the system. This, of course, is not the fault of dependents, but how our economy prioritizes them, using them up until the back is frail and geriatric. The other extreme being child labor. Um, Seriously, and I think we're sort of returning to that in America, mostly with child labor, migrant labor, I think. Anyways, on the foundation of on the foundation of anti-divorce, anti-abortion, anti-environmentalism, it makes a small contradictory claim in terms of affordable families by criticizing those who claims it's expensive to raise a child, then goes into existing plans of underground adoption centers specifically focusing on white children, the price to adopt up to $15,000 to $20,000. The battle over welfare is actually reproductive politics. The stain on welfare from slurs like welfare queen, breeding machines, and changing demographics, altering voter bases, the instability is connected to elites raising prices and crippling the housing market because of how they see America changing. There's a bit of blackmail towards women. The book going over mildly nudging her to adopt after getting an abortion, pointing out this would yield 80,000 babies. Of course, Ben Wattenberg points this out knowing the iffy coercion line might be passed, thus not completely promoting this as direct policy. Ironically, after Roe was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2022, people across the world were telling women to adopt or send their kid up for adoption instead of aborting. Which, I can understand why some people might do that, but it's kind of insane if you're like hours away and this person doesn't even really know you and you're just expected and to have faith that this person will like I don't know, have their child for you. Like that's crazy. Like you can't just trust that people will actually be like that. All right, 3. As I've gone over already, so does Ben towards the end of the chapter Practical Plans, where he brings up uh, international family planning, criticizing the mild and mildly praising the reasons it's been applied to the public, lowering the third world. He continues, quote, that it's good for beneficiaries, good for maternal health, which is true because women are forced to have children in religious fertility cults, but it assumes power regardless. Um, Points out the myth of declining food in the face of population. Obviously, this is true locally, but globally, this is not true, especially when it's manufactured globally at this point, and preserves the natural environment. Highlights that it's actually good for donor nations and that this aspect of international family planning should be mentioned more, but is aware Foundation leaders don't want to be known as colonial and racist. Ben writing this in the 80s was definitely referring to back in the 60s and 70s when it was up to United States aid to deliver contraception to the world's poor. Labeled as an epidemiological threat by the CDC, one of the highlighted figures of this ideological movement, for better or worse, Ramir T. Ravenhold, an article titled, quote, Adventures in Epidemiology, and I made a video about this actually, lists him praising various missions, China's one-child policy success, the harshly criticizing Africa for its multiple crises. Ravenholt had an unpublished paper railing against their poverty and how lucky Africans should be. Quote, although African blacks still heap incessant blame upon contemporary white populations because earlier white populations owned black slaves, this is an inappropriate onus. Rather, American blacks should thank their lucky stars that the institution of slavery did exist in the earlier centuries. If not, these American blacks would not exist. Their ancestors would have been killed by their black enemies instead of being sold as slaves. The only way Africans were then able to get to America was in slave ships, and because their ancestors were transported here as slaves, many millions of blacks are living at far better in America than are their cousins in Africa, where starvation and the killing fields prevail. So, in the Florida Board of Education, there was like this PragerU uh, thing they were going to teach that basically said the same thing that the benefits of like after slavery and of slavery. You know, it's really twisted that we are headed this way in America, like hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, not that slavery was 300 years ago. I think it was barely 200 years. I think people like to push it back further than it actually is, so it's really crazy. Anyways, Ben didn't go this far, being vague enough about international birth reduction attempts, and so this is not giving him credit for not optically saying the quiet part out loud. It's possible what he advocates in the final chapter called Spirit shifts away from human population issue as a disease, and the world order saw humans as a war on terror. The chapter centers on observing the fertility patterns of Middle Eastern populations, specifically Jewish populations going through internal problems, terrorism, and applying pressure from the Palestinian occupied territory. Says that they have lots of children through pride and fear, when some die in war and women produce insurance generations. He implies U.S. youth need to be put under the exact model, pride and fear, to boost the fertility rate. It's possible the false pretenses of the weapons of mass destruction and what Eco Umberto calls inventing the enemy. Sorry, it's getting late, was a red carpet for the new birth manipulation scheme. Echo says after World War II, defeating the main threat at the time, short-lived glory made the nation stall during peacetime, or so the paranoia goes with decadence decay, thus needing a new force to unite against, until bin Laden, cannibalizing an old enemy that fought the Soviet Union, and gave Bush the opportunity to create new enemies. And a side effect to the nation's people with mass surveillance under the Patriot Act 45 days after 9/11. It was confirmed in June 6, 2013 by Edward Snowden leaking national security information, quote, under Security 215 of the Patriot Act, the U.S. government collects on a daily basis the phone records of millions of Americans, and the roll-out of monitoring technology has only advanced further under the Fourth Industrial Revolution, coined by Klaus Schwab. The Republican strategies of Reagan neoliberal order and Bush's New World Order to further expand militarily and pressure our values of cosmopolitanism was scapegoated all onto the left. Ancient anger was unleashed on 9/11 with a letter to America, understandably tied to the misery of colonialism, the 1776 establishment of the United States as an independent sovereign superpower that's connected to the European Balfour Declaration, its Middle Eastern world building of the proxy war that is Israel itself, British Zionists establishing that, quote, our wish is that Arabian countries shall be for Arabs, Armenia for the Armenians, and Judea for the Jews. The Jewish population gained the Palestinian territory, but are broadly targeted into anti-Semitic tropes by Osama and the Taliban, unfortunately associated with Israel colonialism. Right-wing commentators like Dinesh D'Souza, Stephen Mosher ignores the oil wars and long history of colonialism in the Middle East to cast global blame on leftist principles. The left, quote, fostered the decadent American culture that angers and repulses traditional societies, especially those in the Islamic world that are being overwhelmed with this culture, waging an aggressive global campaign to undermine the traditional patriarchal family and to promote secular values in non-Western cultures. Now, overall, this is true. Like, we do pressure our values, but this is not really a leftist thing that we're doing. Now, um, abortion, contraceptives have been associated with the left and like feminism, but these are weapons. These aren't just like a one side uses them. They are used by all sides for specific reasons, mostly because women need them or don't need them. Like the proper like living standards to have a child instead of being put into the position to have abortions or need contraception. Now, obviously, women choose these things. So, anyways, essentially blaming terrorism on abortion, divorce, homosexuality, and promiscuous behavior under a perceived dying patriarchy. Conservatives uniting in spirit with Sharia law fundamentalists. After 9/11 in early 2000s, there was direct population emergency language about radical Middle Eastern youth, or, quote, youth bulge terrorism, or youth bulge terrorism, because of the pride and fear, if the hype meant anything. Historian Paul Kennedy, who also feared Japan would take over in the 80s, wrote about the Muslim question, so to speak. Quote, hundreds of millions, literally hundreds of millions, of youthful Arabs and Muslims being seen as a pressure cooker or a demographic boiling over, circling back to the aspects of the Malthusian matrix crises in the form of, quote, overpopulation, poverty, and young male frustration to terrorize the West and Israel in particular, as it's the biggest colonial target of Western creation, which could obliterate Israel or drive it to some desperate action. This very contentious prophecy of demographics being destiny had Ben Wattenberg skeptical. as Paul Kennedy comes off overly cynical to Ben's open optimism, telling Paul to calm down. Ironically enough, we've seen more domestic terrorism over Islamic fundamentalism attacks as cited by Homeland Security. So, mostly like Christian terrorism and people killing in the name of like changing demographics. So, white people for the most part, or like white passing. I feel like African Americans killing because of changing demographics is probably pretty rare, but you know, I'm sure it happens. Alright. Unfortunately, the prophecy was half true, despite Ben Wanberg in his book Fewer saying the Palestinian territory population would grow to 6.9 million in 2025, and the Palestinians modernizing with Israel, if not for the apartheid, which is left out in the book. Israel indeed lashed out at the occupied territory after the 2023 October 7th terrorist attack from Hamas, retaliation by Israel killing close to 500,000 in a witch hunt for terrorism in tunnels, hospitals, schools, basically all infrastructure, while leaders of Hamas were never in Gaza. Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu almost speaking for the youth bulge, saying on X the Israel-Hamas situation was, quote, a struggle between the children of light and children of darkness, then deleted the post. What's disturbing is not only is Hamas not stationed in Gaza or Rafah, but the Gazan population was almost half children under 18, and essentializing the children as pure evil terrorists just because the population is associated with terrorism. So, I'll see you guys in the next one.